Of all the strange and tragic tales in the annals of rock and roll, few are as bizarre, as mythic, and as profoundly weird as the final chapter of Gram Parsons. The story is famous for its ending: a stolen corpse, a drunken pact, and a makeshift funeral pyre in the California desert. But to understand how a life could possibly arrive at such a surreal conclusion, you have to go back to the very beginning. The story of Gram Parsons is not just about his death. It's about a life steeped in Southern wealth, immense tragedy, and a relentless search for an authentic sound he called cosmic American music. Ingram Cecil Connor III was born on November 5, 1946, in Winter Haven, Florida. He was not born into poverty or the hardscrabble life that defined the country music he would one day champion. Instead, he was the heir to a significant citrus fruit fortune. His maternal grandfather, John A. Snively, was a hugely successful citrus magnate who had built a veritable empire in Central Florida. From the outside, it was a life of privilege, complete with private schools and inherited wealth. But behind the facade of Southern aristocracy, the Connor family was deeply and tragically dysfunctional. His father, Ingram Cecil Coondog Connor Jr., was a decorated World War II flying ace who had flown numerous bombing missions. He was regarded as a war hero, but the conflict left him with deep, unhealed psychological wounds, what we would now recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. He struggled to adapt to civilian life and descended into alcoholism, a battle he could not win. Gram's mother, Avis Snively Connor, was the daughter of the Citrus King, a society woman who also suffered from severe depression and a crippling addiction to alcohol. The household was a volatile environment of wealth, emotional neglect, and the constant presence of substance abuse. This early exposure to profound pain and emotional chaos became a defining feature of Gram's life and later, his music. He found an early escape in the burgeoning sound of rock and roll. In 1956, at the age of 9, his family took him to see Elvis Presley perform in Waycross, Georgia. The experience was transformative. Seeing Elvis, a fellow Southerner who blended country, blues, and gospel into something new and explosive, lit a fire in the young boy. It was a vision of what was possible, a way to channel the turmoil he felt into something powerful. The defining tragedy of his young life occurred 2 days before Christmas in 1958. Gram was just 12 years old when his father, Coondog Connor, died by suicide. The official cause of death was a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The loss of his father, a man he idolized despite his flaws, was a devastating blow from which Gram never fully recovered. Themes of loss, absent fathers, and a yearning for stability would permeate his later songwriting. Following his father's death, Gram's mother Avis moved him and his younger sister, also named Avis, to her hometown of Winter Haven. She soon remarried a man named Robert Parsons. Robert adopted the 2 Connor children, and as a result, Ingram Cecil Connor III legally became Gram Parsons. While the name change was official, the new family structure did little to heal the underlying wounds. Avis's alcoholism worsened, and Robert Parsons, while providing a new family name, was reportedly more interested in the family's wealth than in being a father figure. Gram poured himself into music. He formed his first band, the Pacers, which played rock and roll covers at local teen centers. He then moved on to a more serious folk group, the Shilohs. With the Shilohs, he developed his vocal skills and stage presence, even moving to Greenwich Village in New York City for a time in the early 1960s to immerse himself in the burgeoning folk scene. Another devastating tragedy struck in 1965. On the very day of Gram's graduation from the prestigious Bowley School in Jacksonville, Florida, his mother, Avis, died from cirrhosis of the liver, a direct result of her long battle with alcoholism. At just 18 years old, Gram Parsons was now an orphan. He had lost both of his parents to the twin demons of suicide and addiction. This immense layered grief would become the emotional wellspring for much of his art. His songs often carried a weight of sorrow, a sense of failed salvation that felt far older than his years. Despite his personal turmoil, Parsons briefly enrolled at Harvard University in the fall of 1965 to study theology. The academic life, however, could not compete with his musical ambitions. He spent more time playing music in the folk clubs around Cambridge, Massachusetts, than he did in the classroom. It was there that he formed his next and most important early group, the International Submarine Band. With the International Submarine Band, ISB, Parsons began to fully articulate his musical vision. He was no longer interested in just playing folk or rock and roll. He wanted to merge the raw, emotional honesty of traditional country music, artists like Merle Haggard and George Jones, with the energy and attitude of rock. This was a radical idea in the mid-1960s. The rock counterculture generally viewed country music as conservative and old-fashioned, while the Nashville country establishment saw rock music as noisy and corrupting. Parsons saw the common ground. Both were forms of American roots music that spoke of pain, love, and loss. The ISB relocated to Los Angeles, and after several lineup changes, they secured a record deal with LHI Records, a label owned by Lee Hazelwood. In 1967, they recorded the album Safe at Home. The record is now considered a foundational document of the country rock genre. It featured country standards like Blue Eyes and A Satisfied Mind, alongside Parsons' own compositions. However, upon its release in 1968, Safe at Home was a commercial flop. The band broke up shortly before the album even hit the shelves, leaving Parsons once again adrift in Los Angeles. But his talent was too immense to go unnoticed for long. In early 1968, through a connection with musician Chris Hillman, Parsons was invited to audition for the pioneering folk rock band, the Byrds. The band was looking to replace David Crosby and Michael Clark and was in a state of creative flux. Parsons was initially brought on as a jazz pianist, an idea that seems almost comical in retrospect. However, once he was in the band, his passion for country music became infectious. He quickly moved from being a sideman to the dominant creative force, convincing leader Roger McGuinn to scrap their planned concept album and instead record an entire album of country music in Nashville. The result was Sweetheart of the Rodeo, released in August 1968. This album was a watershed moment. It was the sound of a major established rock band fully embracing country music. They recorded with legendary Nashville session musicians and covered songs by the Louvain brothers, Merle Haggard, and Woody Guthrie. Parsons took the lead vocal on several tracks, including You're Still on My Mind and Life in Prison. His soulful, aching voice was the authentic heart of the project. The album, however, was not without controversy. The old guard of Nashville was deeply suspicious of these long-haired California rockers. The Byrds' appearance at the Grand Ole Opry, the hallowed temple of country music, became a legendary disaster. They were scheduled to play a Merle Haggard song, but Parsons, in a moment of defiance, announced from the stage they were going to play one of his own compositions, Hickory Wind, a nostalgic ballad about his childhood. It was seen as a grave insult to the Opry establishment. Further complicating matters, a legal dispute with his old label, LHI Records, led to several of Parsons' lead vocals being erased from the final album and re-recorded by Roger McGuinn. This was a bitter pill for Parsons, who felt his contribution had been marginalized. During a tour of the United Kingdom with the Byrds, Parsons struck up a deep and transformative friendship with Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones. The two musicians recognized a shared love for American roots music. Richards was fascinated by Parsons' encyclopedic knowledge of country and blues, and Parsons was captivated by the Stones' raw power and rebellious lifestyle. This friendship would become both a source of immense creative inspiration and a gateway to a more destructive, hedonistic lifestyle. On the eve of a planned tour of South Africa with the Byrds, Parsons abruptly quit the band. He cited his opposition to the country's apartheid policies as the reason, stating he refused to perform for a segregated audience. While his political stance was genuine, it was also clear that his growing bond with Richards and the allure of the Stones' orbit played a significant role in his decision. Freed from the Byrds, Parsons and fellow ex-Byrd Chris Hillman decided to form a new band to fully realize their country rock vision. They called themselves the Flying Burrito Brothers. This band was Parsons' purest expression of his cosmic American music, a blend of country, rock, soul, R&B, and gospel. They recruited bassist Chris Etheridge and pedal steel guitarist Sneaky Pete Cleanow, whose psychedelic experimental approach to his instrument became a hallmark of their sound. Visually, they made a powerful statement. They commissioned Nudie Cohn, the famous tailor to country stars like Hank Williams and Porter Wagoner, to create custom-made suits, but these were not traditional Nudie suits. Parsons' suit was famously adorned with images of marijuana leaves, pills, and a cross, perfectly symbolizing his blend of the sacred and the profane. In 1969, they released their debut album, The Gilded Palace of Sin. The album is a masterpiece of the genre. Songs like Sin City, Wheels, and Hot Burrito Dibre One showcased Parsons and Hillman's songwriting, which was both cynical and deeply romantic. Parsons' vocals were raw and vulnerable, filled with a heartbreaking honesty. Despite universal critical acclaim, the album sold poorly. It was too country for rock radio and too rock for country radio. The band's live performances were notoriously erratic, largely due to Parsons' escalating drug and alcohol abuse. He was becoming increasingly unreliable, often showing up late to gigs or too intoxicated to perform well. The band even performed at the infamous Altamont Free concert in December 1969, a chaotic and violent event that seemed to symbolize the death of the peace and love era. By 1970, the tensions within the band reached a breaking point. Chris Hillman, who had been Parsons' musical partner since the Byrds, could no longer tolerate his self-destructive behavior. After a particularly disastrous performance, Gram Parsons was fired from the band he had founded. The next couple of years were a period of drift for Parsons. He spent a significant amount of time in the south of France with Keith Richards and his entourage during the recording of the Stones' classic album Exile on Main Street. He was a constant presence at the Villa Nelcote, contributing to the creative atmosphere and deepening his heroin addiction. It's widely believed that Parsons was a major influence on the country-inflected sound of the album, and he is often credited with arranging the vocals for the song Sweet Virginia. He also wrote the song Wild Horses, which the Stones recorded, although his version would not be released until after his death. His relationship with the Stones, however, became strained as his drug use spiraled further out of control, and he was eventually asked to leave the villa. A turning point came in 1971 when Parsons, back in the U.S., discovered the music of a young folk singer named Emmylou Harris. He was mesmerized by her pure, clear voice and sought her out. The two formed an immediate and profound musical partnership. Harris was not familiar with country music, but Parsons became her mentor, teaching her the phrasing and emotional delivery of singers like George Jones and Merle Haggard. In return, Her voice provided the perfect harmony for his, a crystalline counterpoint to his raw, world-weary tenor. She became his musical soulmate, and their duets are considered among the greatest in country music history. With this renewed sense of purpose, Parsons secured a solo contract with Reprise Records and began work on his first solo album in 1972. With Emmylou Harris by his side and backed by members of Elvis Presley's TCB band, including James Burton on guitar, he recorded the album GP, released in early 1973. The album was a stunning artistic statement featuring classics like She and A Song for You. The interplay between Parsons and Harris's voices was magical. Once again, critics loved it, but commercial success remained elusive. During this period, Parsons developed a deep spiritual connection to the high desert of Southern California, particularly the area around Joshua Tree National Monument. He saw it as a place of vast, mystical beauty, a landscape that seemed to reflect the desolate and awe-inspiring nature of his own music. It became his personal sanctuary, a place to escape, create, and indulge his addictions. He was managed by a man named Phil Kaufman, a notorious road manager and fixer who had worked with the Rolling Stones and other rock acts. Kaufman was a wild character, a loyal friend who fully embraced the rock and roll lifestyle. He and Parsons became incredibly close. During one of their many long drunken nights, they made a morbid pact. Parsons told Kaufman that he didn't want a traditional funeral. He didn't want a somber religious ceremony. Instead, he wanted his body to be taken to his beloved Joshua Tree, to be cremated in the desert, and to have his ashes scattered across Cap Rock, a prominent rock formation. Kaufman, seeing the drunken sincerity in his friend's eyes, agreed. "It's a deal," he said. It seemed like a fantastical, alcohol-fueled promise that would never need to be kept. In the summer of 1973, Parsons returned to the studio to record his second solo album, which would be titled Grievous Angel. The sessions produced some of his most enduring work, including the iconic duet with Harris on Love Hurts and the title track. The album was a masterpiece, a culmination of his entire musical journey. He finished recording and, exhausted, decided to retreat to Joshua Tree for a period of rest and relaxation before the album's release. On September 18, 1973, Parsons checked into room 8 of the Joshua Tree Inn with his girlfriend and a couple of friends. He spent the day consuming large quantities of alcohol and drugs. In the early morning hours of September 19th, he was discovered unconscious. Paramedics were called, but it was too late. Gram Parsons was pronounced dead on arrival at a nearby hospital. The official cause of death was an overdose of morphine and alcohol. He was 26 years old. The news of his death sent shockwaves through the music world. Grievous Angel would be released posthumously in 1974, becoming his most celebrated work and a cornerstone of the Americana genre. But the story was far from over. Gram's stepfather, Robert Parsons, immediately made arrangements for the body to be flown to New Orleans, Louisiana for a private family burial. Phil Kaufman was suspicious of the motive. He believed Robert Parsons stood to gain a significant inheritance from Gram's grandfather's estate, but only if Gram was buried in Louisiana as stipulated in a clause. For Kaufman, this was a betrayal of everything Gram stood for. More importantly, he remembered the pact. Kaufman decided to take matters into his own hands. He enlisted the help of a friend, Michael Martin. They borrowed Martin's dilapidated hearse, loaded it with beer, and drove to Los Angeles International Airport, where Gram's body was being held at a hangar before being shipped to Louisiana. In an act of unbelievable audacity, Kaufman, dressed in a slightly too small suit, marched into the hangar and, armed with a fake document and a lot of confidence, told the clerk he was there on behalf of the family to pick up the body. In the less security-conscious era of 1973, the bluff worked. The shocked airline employee released the 200-pound casket into their custody. They loaded the coffin into the back of the hearse and began the long, surreal drive east towards the desert. They stopped to buy a 5-gallon can of gasoline and continued their journey to Joshua Tree National Park. As night fell, they drove into the park searching for Cap Rock, the spot Gram had mentioned. Under the desert stars, they dragged the heavy coffin out to the base of the rock formation. Kaufman pried it open to see his friend one last time. Then he poured the 5 gallons of gasoline into the open casket and threw a lit match. The result was a massive fireball that lit up the night sky, a pillar of flame in the silent desert. They had fulfilled their promise. They quickly drove away as the makeshift pyre burned. The bizarre funeral did not go unnoticed. Campers and park rangers saw the fire and reported it. The next day, authorities found the charred, half-burned coffin and the partially cremated remains of Gram Parsons. Kaufman and Martin were arrested a few days later. However, they were faced with a legal quandary. While they had stolen a coffin, there was no specific law in California at the time against stealing a dead body, as it was not considered property. Ultimately, they were charged only with the theft of the coffin itself. They were fined $750 and given a suspended jail sentence. The remaining parts of Parsons' body were eventually sent to Louisiana and buried. The story of the stolen body and the desert cremation became an instant rock and roll legend. It was the perfect, chaotic, and defiantly romantic end to a life lived against the grain. It cemented Gram Parsons' status as a mythic figure, a grievous angel whose tragic life and outlaw death became as famous as his music. Today, Gram Parsons' legacy endures. His vision of cosmic American music laid the groundwork for the entire Americana and alternative country movement. Artists from the Eagles and Linda Ronstadt to Ryan Adams and Wilco owe a significant debt to his pioneering sound. His 2 solo albums are consistently ranked among the greatest of all time. He remains a symbol of artistic purity, a man who refused to compromise his vision, even if it meant never achieving mainstream success in his lifetime. The story of his life, marked by immense pain and transcendent beauty, and ending with one of the most audacious acts of friendship in music history, ensures that the legend of the cosmic cowboy will never fade away.